It is so good to see you. So glad that you're here. As John said, if you're watching online, we're glad that you're watching. As we jump in today, I've got a question I want to ask you. And this may sound a little bit personal, but I want you to stick with me. What do you think the number one health issue is that you're currently facing? Now, aren't you glad you came to church today, right? Like, yes, we'll be reminded of. Most of the time we think about that, we think of the usual suspects, right? Cancer, heart disease, maybe high blood pressure or diabetes or something like that. But the truth is, unless you already have something that you're dealing with, researchers say that it probably depends on when you were born. What we've discovered is that people born in different generations face different health problems. So let me show you a chart of what I'm talking about. This one did not make the chart, but if you're a member of what's called the silent generation, meaning that you were born between 1928 and 1945, then researchers say that the number one health issue that you're most likely facing is mobility issues and some kind of fall-related complication. Now, if you're a baby boomer born between 1946 and 1964, the number one health issue you're most likely facing is heart disease, mostly fueled by some choices you made in your lifestyle in terms of diet and smoking and stress. We all get that. Now, here's where it gets interesting. You get to Gen X, those born 1965 to 1980. You see what the number one health issue is they're facing? Chronic stress, which can lead to things like high blood pressure, diabetes, and high rates of burnout. Let's keep going. Talk about millennials, those born 1981 to 1996. The number one health issue, according to researchers, that they're most likely facing is anxiety and depression caused by things like student loan debt, housing costs, career pressure, and what researchers call constant connectivity. Let's go to Gen Z, born 1997 to 2012. You can see it there for yourself. It's mental health, especially anxiety, depression, and loneliness. One researcher said Generation Z is the most anxious generation on record. And then lastly, you have what's called Generation Alpha, which is those born between 2013 and the present. Their number one health issue, this will come as no surprise to some of you, is screen-related developmental concerns. They spend so much time looking at screens that they have a hard time functioning in a world without screens. But what I hope you see there is a pattern. The health issues that people are facing in today's world are a lot different than what they used to face in previous generations. And many of that is caused by anxiety, mental health, anxiety-related issues, and all of that sort of gets tied together to form all sorts of mental health issues. But we know it's not just members of the current generation. It's anxiety and anxiety-related issues are causing problems for members of every generation. It's gotten so bad, I read this week, that 61% of the members of Gen Z have now been formally diagnosed with some type of anxiety disorder. 61%. Some researchers say that number should be higher. And yet we know it's not limited to just members of Gen Z. It's affecting everybody. So with that in mind, if you have your Bible, I want you to turn to Philippians chapter 4. This morning we're launching a new series that we're calling Anxious for Nothing, in which we're going to look at what the Apostle Paul said about overcoming anxiety. And we're going to start by looking at just part of this letter that Paul wrote to the church in Philippi. It was located on the northeastern shore of Greece. I've got a map just to show you where it's located. Just as a historical footnote, the church in Philippi was the first church ever founded on the continent of Europe. Paul had gone there during his first missionary journey, and somewhere around the year 50 AD, he planted this church. As best we can tell, he stayed there for a couple years, helping them get things off the ground, helping to get things going, and then he left and he went to new places to repeat the same process. And so by the time he wrote the letter that we're getting ready to look at, that we call Philippians, he had been gone for a while, and during that time, his life had gotten increasingly complicated. In fact, it was so complicated that even as he wrote the words we're getting ready to look at, he was in prison in Rome, awaiting the verdict of his trial, which would determine whether or not he would live or die. So this is one of Paul's prison letters. It's hard to imagine somebody being in a more stressful situation than the one that Paul was facing. And yet when you get to Philippians 4, he launches in this. He first gently addresses a problem within the church, and then he talks about how to overcome anxiety. So if you have your Bible open to Philippians 1, I want you to look at this with me, starting in verse 1. Paul writes, "Therefore, my brothers and sisters, you whom I love and long for, my joy and my crown, stand firm in the Lord in this way, dear friends. I plead with Euodia and I plead with Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. Yes, and I ask you, my true companion, help these women since they have contended at my side in the cause of the gospel, along with Clement and the rest of my co-workers whose names are in the book of life." Now, just to give you some context, I know this is hard to imagine, but keep in mind, Paul's writing to a church just like us, filled with people just like us. And apparently what's happened is there are these two women who were both a big part of the church who had somehow gotten sideways with one another. And Paul never tells us what the issue was. My suspicion is it was probably some sort of clash of personalities, because that's almost always what it is. And so Paul tells them, hey, what you guys are doing is now threatening the unity of the church. And so it's time for you guys to set aside whatever it is you're disagreeing about and get together for the sake of the mission. It's a good reminder for us every time we read this part that if there's somebody here that you go to church with that you're mad at about something, here's what Paul would say. Get over it. Get over it, move past it, and come together for the sake of what's most important, which is not your disagreements, but reaching people with the gospel. And then you get down to verse 4, and Paul launches into this plan for battling anxiety. And before we unpack it, though, I want to take just a moment and define what it is we're talking about when we use that word, because we know the word anxiety can mean lots of different things to lots of different people. So for our purposes for the next couple of weeks, we're going to use this definition taken from the American Psychological Association, which says this: anxiety is an emotion characterized by apprehension and somatic symptoms of tension in which an individual anticipates impending danger, catastrophe, or misfortune. Now, to be clear, anxiety is different than fear. Fear is a response to a specific threat. So, for example, if you're walking outside and a snake pops up in front of you, you may take a step back or you may even run, but that is a response to the threat that's in front of you. You move because you don't want to get bitten. It's a response to a specific threat. Anxiety, on the other hand, is more generalized. One doctor described it as a chronic feeling of apprehension about potential future, unknown, or hypothetical threats. Anxiety is when you stay in the house because you're scared there potentially might be a snake outside that might bite you. One is a response to something specific. The other is tied to a hypothetical. And one of the things we know now that we didn't know in previous days is that anxiety takes a greater toll on your body than even fear does. A couple years ago, Max Lucado wrote a great book titled Anxious for Nothing, where we got the title for this series. And in the book, he describes the effects of anxiety on the body. And some of you have felt these. He said, anxiety will steal your breath away. It'll take your sleep. It leads to stiff necks, clenched jaws, and overactive bowels. Anxiety can twist us into emotional pretzels. It can make our eyes twitch, our blood pressure rise, our armpits sweat. One doctor said, if you really want to see the consequences of anxiety, just read about half the ailments in the medical textbook today. He then ends with these words. He said, the problem with anxiety is absolutely real, and many of us are working through it right now. The presence of anxiety is unavoidable, but the prison of anxiety is optional. It's that last sentence that I want us to spend a few minutes thinking about this morning. Whether we like it or not, we now live in a culture that just breeds anxiety. And yet the Bible is clear that as followers of Jesus, we're not condemned to live as prisoners of our own fears and apprehensions. And so the question is, how do we battle against it? And the reality is that most people don't. You know, it's true. Most people who suffer with some sort of anxiety, not everybody, but a huge percentage of people have chosen to continue to feed their anxiety by embracing practices that create even more anxiety. And yet, when you look at what Paul writes, you see a game plan for overcoming anxiety. So I want you to look at this with me, starting in verse 4. And again, just as a side note, the verses we're getting ready to look at, verses 4 through 9, the last year, the Bible app that everybody has on their phone, sponsored by Life Church out in Oklahoma, they said in 2025, the verses we're getting to look at were the most downloaded and highlighted verses in people's phones in 2025. Because this is a problem that everybody struggles with. Here's what Paul says in verse 4. Rejoice in the Lord always. I'll say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your request to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Now, when we first look at this, it seems like it's just a bunch of disconnected one-liners. Like Paul says this, and then he says this other thing. But when you put them together, you see they form this powerful game plan for overcoming anxiety. So if you're tracking with us, here's the first thing Paul says. He says, you overcome anxiety by rejoicing that God is near. So he writes, rejoice in the Lord always. Then he says it again, rejoice. And then he tells us why we should rejoice when he says that the Lord is near. According to Paul, one of the best antidotes for worry and anxiety is worship. Now, most of the time when we're anxious because of what we feel like is happening around us, happening to us, or what might happen to us in the future. It's either about what we see in front of us or what we're afraid is going to come around the next corner. And if you think about Paul's situation, it's hard to imagine somebody that would be in a more anxious situation than he was. I mean, here he was in this Roman prison awaiting the trial, the verdict of his trial that would determine whether he lived or died. You think about cruel and unusual punishment, it would be hard to describe something worse than what he was thinking. I mean, even like the worst prison today would look like a resort compared to what Paul was going through. At the same time, he knows that at any moment, his cell door might swing open, the soldiers might come get him, and he'll be led to his death. Now your circumstances probably aren't as dramatic as Paul's, but that doesn't mean they're any less real. Many of you came in this morning, you're anxious about what's happening to you, what's happening around you, or what you fear might be coming around the next corner. That's a natural response. Or maybe you're like a lot of people, and I struggle with this sometimes, and you obsess over the what if questions. You're always asking, what if something goes wrong? What if I lose my job and I can't find another one? What if my transmission goes out and I can't afford to repair it? What if we go to war with Iran? What if protesters storm into my church? What if ICE agents come to Kentucky? What if we have another pandemic? What if one of my kids gets sick? What if I get sick? What if my spouse leaves? What if my spouse comes back? What if I lose my memory? What if I lose my mobility? What if I lose my memory and my mobility? Max Lucado said, anxiety is a meteor shower of what ifs. And some of us have lived with that for a long time. Think about Paul's situation. He's got all these what if questions he could have been asking. What if the Romans decide to kill me? What if they decide that killing me is not enough and they torture me first? What if all those churches I started, what if they all fall away because of what's happened to me? What if for those false teachers who infiltrated those churches, what if they lead people away from the gospel? What if the movement I spent my life building dies with me? And there were so many things that must have weighed on Paul's heart. And yet he made a conscious decision not to choose worry, but to choose worship. He chose to rejoice, not what was happening to him, but in who was near him. I've got a picture I want to show you. Last year, the lady you see on the screen, Rebecca McLaughlin, partnered with the Harvard School of Public Health. They did a long-range study to determine the effects that weekly worship attendance have on people's mental health. And out of that came a book she wrote, How the Church Could Literally Save Your Life. And what they discovered is that people who attend a worship service once a week have a 20 to 30% lower likelihood of dying over a 15-year period. In fact, they found that people who attend worship on average live 7 years longer than those who don't. People who attend church are 33% less likely to suffer from depression and debilitating anxiety, and 50% less likely to die from suicide, drug, or alcohol-related causes. Here was their conclusion. Study after study has shown that people who attend religious services once a week or more are happier, healthier, and live longer lives than those who don't. You say, well, why would that be true? It's because every time we gather for worship, it's a reminder not of what's happening to us, but of who is near us. And somehow that helps. Now, here's the second thing Paul says we need to do as we battle against anxiety, and that's to pray intentionally. Look at verse 6. He says, do not be anxious about anything, which sounds like that's impossible to do. But then he says, but in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your request to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. So Paul says, just like worship can be the antidote to worry, he says that prayer can help us escape the prison of anxiety. That phrase, do not be anxious about anything, is written in what's called a present indicative. So it's describing this ongoing reality, an ongoing issue. It's as if Paul is saying, do not live in a perpetual state of anxiety. Rather than sitting around worrying about what's happening, what might happen, or what could happen, Paul says we're to pray about every situation, with the result being that we won't be anxious about anything because we've taken the time to pray about everything. So when you look at this in verse 6, there are three different words, specific words, that Paul uses that when taken together describe exactly how we're to pray. He uses the words prayer, petition, and request. Now, at first glance, it seems like it's just three different ways of saying the same thing, but I think there's something deeper going on here. And I put this on the screen. You see the bullseye, because as you go through this, it's like a funnel. Paul continues to narrow it down. So let's just start with the first word he uses, and that's the word prayer. What is prayer? In this context, Paul's describing like a general attitude or a worshipful posture. So you might think of prayer. He's talking about kind of this generic prayer in which you ask God to do something generally. So I'll give you an example. At our house, we always pray before we eat because we're super spiritual like that. And so we always pray, and we're careful to rotate it around. So the boys over time have developed their own style of prayer, right? They don't just echo us. They kind of, and Jack, my youngest, he always prays pretty much the same thing. It goes like this. He'll say, God, help everybody feel better. Help you feel better, which I'm still trying to figure that out. Help everybody go to heaven, and thank you for the food. That's what he prays. Now, you may have some questions about that, because I do too. But that's not bad. I mean, that's actually a pretty good place to start. That's a general prayer. You're asking God to generally do something that will be beneficial to everybody. That's what prayer is. But then Paul uses the word petition, or your translation might use the word supplication. To make a petition suggests humility on your part. Like if you're the petitioner or you're the supplicant, you're acknowledging that you're not in a position to make any kind of demand. You're just simply asking God. You're making a request. You might think about this. Rather than asking God to do something in a general way, when you petition God, you're asking God to help in a specific area. So it's not just God, help me. It's God, help me figure out my finances, or help me to figure out my physical health, or help my mental health, or heal my relationships. You get the point. A petition is a little more specific than a prayer. But then you get down to where he uses the word request. And a request, that's what you want to get to. A request is always something definite and specific. That's where the bullseye comes in. When you make a request to God, you're asking him to do something definite in a specific area. And it's hard to explain, but some of you have experienced this. There's something incredibly powerful about naming exactly what it is that's making you so anxious that makes it easier to deal with that thing. It's almost as if naming it somehow releases some of the pressure that's been built up. One of the things that makes anxiety so difficult to deal with is it's always so vague. It's always so ill-defined. But if you can somehow name what it is that you're struggling with, and then make a specific request for God to help with that thing, you start to cut what feels like it's overwhelming. You start to cut it down to size. So let me give you an example. It's one thing to pray, Lord, help me in the area of my finances this month. That's not bad. But it's better to get specific and say, Lord, you know I've been trying to get out of debt all these last few months. Will you help me to stick to the budget that I created? Will you give me the courage to say no to the things I don't need, the discipline to save as much as I can, and the resolve to give cheerfully to the things that are closest to your heart? Knowing that you've promised to supply my every need. Lord, will you help me not to panic when an unexpected expense pops up, but to trust that your word is true and you're going to supply what I need and you're going to lead me? Do you see how different that is? One is kind of general. The other is specific, and there's something about getting specific that cuts everything down to size. And when you pray that way, it's also easier to see how God has helped you in the past. And so it builds confidence that he'll continue to help you in the future. Now, there's one more thing you see in this passage. This may be the hardest to do in the culture that we live in, and that's that if you're going to overcome anxiety, you've got to learn to direct your thoughts. Look at the way Paul says this in verse 8. He says, finally, brothers and sisters, whatever's true, whatever's noble, whatever's right, whatever's pure, whatever's lovely, whatever's admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Whatever you've learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. You might want to underline that where he says, think about such things. It's written in the present tense, meaning it's a command to continually think about things that are right and true and noble and pure and admirable and lovely and excellent and praiseworthy. So he's not saying, think about these things occasionally. He's saying, think about these things all the time. Study these things, dwell on these things, meditate on these things, keep these things constantly on your mind. Now compare that to what most of us spend our time thinking about. Do you know that every single study that's come out in recent years, without exception, every single one has concluded that the more time a person spends on social media, the more likely they are to suffer from anxiety and depression. They've discovered that if you spend 3 hours a day on social media, you're doubling your risk of developing mental health problems. Now, some older people like to hear that and say, see, I knew it was the kids. But the same study found if you spend the same amount of time consuming cable news, you do the same thing to your brain. Cable news and social media. One former employee of Meta, I was reading this week, the company that owns Facebook and Instagram, recently testified before Congress and said that the company who created all this and owns all this has intentionally buried research that show the harmful effects social media is having on the minds of their users. Everything from cyberbullying, screen addiction, anxiety, depression, and increased risk of suicide. Now listen to this. Same congressional hearing, another former employee of Meta admitted that all of the high-ranking executives at Meta, the people who created the social media applications, to a person refuse to allow their children to use the products that they created because they know the harmful effects. One psychologist who, former employee of Meta, said it this way: this is the great irony of social media. The more you immerse yourself in it, the lonelier and more depressed you become. Let me repeat this. The people who created Instagram and Facebook do not let their own children use it. You doubt me? Steve Jobs, the guy who created the iPad, did not let his children have an iPad until they turned 18. And we wonder why we're so stressed out and so anxious. I saw a tweet from I know that's ironic. I saw a tweet from a theologian named Peter Leithart this week, and he rewrote verse 8 to describe what we do in our modern culture. Here's what he said. Finally, brothers, whatever's trending, whatever's hot, whatever's meme-worthy, whatever ticks off liberals and enrages conservatives, whatever makes you laugh out loud, whatever makes a good gif, if there's any excellence or anything worthy of reposting, dwell on these things. And that's why we do. That's what we do. And that's why we're so stressed out. It's like we've spent so much time dwelling on all the bad things that we don't have any space left to dwell on the things that are good for us, that bring peace. But what if there was a better way? What if instead of obsessing over all that stuff, we really did think about things that are true and noble and right and beautiful? What if there was a better way to live that led you to a better place mentally? Paul said there is a better way. And you see in verse 9, he says, whatever you've learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put into practice. Now listen to this part. And he says, and if you do that, the God of peace will be with you. So here's the promise I want you to latch on this morning. If we'll just do what Paul says to do, we have this promise that we'll experience a peace that transcends your circumstance. It's not like this is something that you can never experience. Paul says it's available to us if we'll just put into practice the things that lead to peace. So early in verse 7, he called it a peace that transcends understanding. It goes against what we can humanly imagine. Psalm 23, there's this beautiful verse. Some of you remember, David writes, even though I walk through the darkest valley, your translation might say, the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil, for you are with me. He says, even when I'm walking surrounded by darkness, no matter what's happening around me, what's happening to me, what might be coming around the next corner, I'm not going to live in fear. Now, you think about David's life, man, so many ups and downs, so many great victories. There were some pretty bad self-inflicted wounds, and yet in the middle of all that, he learned not to fear, not because of what was happening around him, but because of who was walking with him. And that's different. So I got one last picture I want to show you. This is C.S. Lewis, one of my favorite writers. He's been coming a while. You hear me talk about him quite frequently. He was an Oxford literature professor who doubled as a brilliant writer, wrote lots of different things in lots of different categories. Mere Christianity, the Screwtape Letters, the Chronicles of Narnia, all of that, which later became a popular movie series. What a lot of people don't know about C.S. Lewis is that for most of his life, he battled anxiety and depression. A lot of people don't know that about him, especially what today would be labeled intrusive thoughts regarding what may or may not happen in the future. He called it himself, he called it an emotional affliction that gnawed at him throughout his life. It became an even bigger problem after the death of his wife, which he wrote about in a great book titled A Grief Observed. So I just want you to know, if you're a person who struggles with this, like, you're in good company. There's been a lot of great heroes that have struggled with this. Thankfully, over time, though, he made some real progress. And later in his life, he was asked about how he'd done it. He described for him how it had been through the practice of surrender, and specifically surrendering those things he was worried about to God's care. In other words, he put into practice what Paul said to do. And he ended with a powerful statement. I just want to share with you this morning. He said this. He said, relying on God has to begin all over again every day as if nothing had yet been done. Say it again. He said, relying on God has to begin all over again every day as if nothing had yet been done. I want you to stand with me. The bands are going to come, and while they come, I just want to issue an invitation. Not so much a challenge as just an invitation. Some of you walked in here this morning and you're carrying a pretty heavy load, and maybe nobody even knows the full extent of everything that you're carrying. You know what it's like to wake up in the middle of the night because your heart is pounding out of your chest. You know how it feels to not be able to catch your breath because of some intrusive thought that keeps swirling around your brain. And maybe up until this point, like a lot of other people, you feel like you've served your sentence in a prison of anxiety. If that's where you find yourself, I just want you to take these next few moments, and we're going to sing together. But if you don't feel like singing, I just want you to pray and start naming some of those specific things that are making you so anxious and pushing you towards it. See, Paul said, do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your request to God. And so you can do that right now. You can start that process. May not end right now, but you can start it. If you'd like to pray with one of us, David's here, I'll be here. We'd be honored to pray with you. Some of you, the thing that's making you anxious may be something that you can take care of right now. Maybe there's a spiritual decision that you know you need to make. Maybe it's been weighing on you for a long time, and you keep putting it off, and you keep putting it off, and it never gets any better. And if you'd like to talk about that, if you're ready to make a public commitment to Christ, if you're unsure of your eternal destiny, we'd be honored to talk to you about that as well. So we're going to sing these two songs. And if you need to pray with somebody or talk to somebody, just meet us on this front row.